Hello and welcome to the Digital Publishing Podcast with me, Simon Mellins, and my co-host, Simon Holt. Episode 11, Accessibility Busybody. In this episode, we interview Laura Brady, the industry-renowned digital publishing and accessibility expert. Laura Brady, we are so thrilled to have you with us for this episode. How are you doing?
I'm well, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Excellent. Yeah, really glad to have you. And I think we're going to end up having quite a wide-ranging discussion today, given all the various different hats that you wear. I guess the first question is kind of the headline question, which is, what is the biggest thing that you see happening in accessibility today?
About 3 webinars on EAA per day, I think. That's the biggest thing.
Yeah, can relate.
There are so many webinars and workshops happening about the European Accessibility Act now. And what I think about that is it's really lovely that everyone is paying attention to this now. Some of that is panic, but that's okay because panic can be productive.
It's a good fuel.
Yes, exactly. Everybody needs a good deadline to get their essay written, right? That's what So it's really nice to see accessibility is in the air. Everyone's talking about it. And you know, if a publisher is not aware of EAA, it's because they have their head firmly planted in the sand, and that's on them. It's not because it's everywhere. Everyone is talking about it. Everyone's offering workshops and webinars, and this is a good thing. It's a good thing to have lots of conversations about it, and it means that people are coming at it from lots of different directions as well, which is also a good thing. And you know, robust and thinking about it and folding into everything we do and how we think about book publishing.
Right. We've always talked about wanting to normalize conversations around accessibility and around disability inclusion. Yeah. And whilst the EAA and similar legislation doesn't solve everybody's problems, it maybe moves the baseline higher and normalizes some of those conversations that maybe weren't so considered standard a few years ago, right?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. I think that's exactly right. For example, I had a client in touch recently about doing some testing, and I said, sure, I'm happy to take this on, but have you thought about, rolling in the labor of people with the lived experience? And they're like, oh, of course. How come we didn't think about that? So they were already aware that that was maybe something they should do. And I had to just push them a little bit gently on that and connect them with the right people. And, there is a better awareness of needing to employ people with the lived experience of a disability and to use people with the lived experience for things like use is the wrong word. Pay people for their time and experience. That's what I mean. And I think that's because it's in the air and it's palpable and everyone is thinking about it. Yeah.
Completely.
Now, Laura, you noted that early on that this is kind of a big moment for accessibility. Everybody's talking about this in publishing, but this is not new for you. You've been on this one for a while. Maybe could you just take us back in time and a little bit about your career and how you ended up doing what you do?
Sure. I actually have such a good story about this. So I was at grad school in the States. I'm Canadian. So I was in the States in grad school, and I over the summer, I got pulled into working on a project digitizing this gigantic corpus of books called the Patrologia Latina. I was studying medieval history, just for a little bit of context. This was in 1992. So now everybody knows a little bit about how old I am, but that's okay. And so I was working in a programming language called SGML, Standard General Markup Language, which is an ancestor of HTML. And then I ditched grad school because I couldn't learn Latin. That's a long, boring story about my lack of language skills. And I moved to Toronto and got a job in book publishing. And the reason I got that job was because I knew SGML, which seems bananas.
That is unusual.
I was working for a publisher who was typesetting everything using a Linux system in SGML. And then exporting to print-ready pages or PDF, an early version of PDF, or to CD-ROM. They were thinking that they needed to be agile in how they published, which is, they were miles ahead of everybody else at that point in time. And in fact, I got a new production manager and abandoned that system and went to a Quark Express WYSIWYG system shortly after that. So my first job in publishing was in 1994, working for an independent publisher in Toronto as a typesetter. So my background is in typesetting. And I worked as a typesetting for a fair few decades, laying out books. And then 2008, 2009 pivoted to ebooks, which was a burgeoning, really interesting new space. So I'm sure you all had similar experiences, but in the early days of ebooks, troubleshooting was really hard because there wasn't a lot of documentation. There wasn't a lot of resources for figuring it out. And I relied on the e-production community on what was then known as Twitter, and which I shall always refer to as Twitter, just for the record.
E-Producton.
Yeah, EPRDCTN. It was a hashtag that was very active for a long time. And this is we had like regular Wednesday morning 11 a.m. EST meetings on Twitter where we all kind of collected and commiserated and complained and found community on Twitter, and that was interesting. And that led to I helped program a conference called eBookcraft, which took place in Toronto for 5 or 6 years. Can't quite remember now. And as part of that programming, of course, we incorporated thinking about accessibility into that programming. So brought in speakers who could speak to that, offered workshops around it, and that sort of thing. And that pushed me into learning more about that space and incorporating accessibility best practices into what I do, and how I talk to publishers, how I talk to other production professionals, and how I talk to other book publishing professionals.
And so I quite like on LinkedIn you describe yourself as an accessibility busybody. And so how did you go from obviously doing the book production and kind of having an interest in access to all to accessibility being kind of the main thing that you do and specialize in then?
Yeah. So I call myself an accessibility busybody, which I think sometimes has negative gendered overtones, but I'm appropriating that back.
Reclaim it.
Yeah, I'm reclaiming it, exactly. And that's partly because I really do have fingers in a lot of pies. So, my work is I make ebooks every day, but I also consult on best practices. I talk to software manufacturers about how to do their job a little bit better. I am on the board of my local public library purely for accessibility reasons, to get them to get rid of their accessibility overlay. It worked.
Bravo.
I'm on the board of the Accessible Books Consortium from Geneva, who oversees the Marrakesh Treaty, in addition to a number of other things. And I consult for a number of book publishers and the IPA. Gosh, sometimes when I think about all the things I do, I forget things, and I'm like, oh yeah, I do that too. And then I remember that why I call myself a busybody. Simon, remind me of your question. I went off on a tangent and then I couldn't remember the nugget of your question.
I guess you kind of answered it backwards, right? So I guess where we got to at the end of the first question was that you were working in e-production and you started to have this interest in widening participation, as we call it. And then obviously now you detailed various of the different hats that you wear. And I guess it would be great just to fill in the gaps a little bit to understand in your journey how you moved from one to the other, right? Where accessibility became a kind of a bit of a thing you were interested in to, okay, this is the main thing that I focus on and kind of am known for.
Yeah. So around like 2014, 2015, this is a weird story, but my family became a puppy sitter for a local service dog program. And so we were helping to raise service dogs in conjunction with a group of at-risk youth at my local high school.
Amazing.
So the local high school was where the training happened, and they used at-risk youth to help with the training, to get them engaged in that training. And we minded the dogs in the evenings and on the weekends. And that whole process, we had to go through fairly rigorous training to understand what these service animals were going to do and how best to train them. For example, when you're a puppy sitter for a service dog program, you're never allowed to be negative to the dog. You always just have to redirect. It was a whole education. And I know that feels like weird, but it is connected to thinking about accessibility in book publishing and thinking about accessibility in a broader way. And that experience helped support how I brought accessibility to the programming of ebook craft. And I said how I brought, it wasn't just me. I need to sort of, it wasn't all me. There was a whole steering committee. There were lots of very smart people involved. But it also changed how I think about creating content and how I think about inclusivity in almost everything I do. So it used to be, I sometimes have nightmares about somebody cracking open a book I made in 2012 and criticizing the HTML, because I promise you it wouldn't be good. But, I have, it has been a process, and it has sort of brought myself and my own best practices along as well. And then that permeates everything I do in terms of how I talk to book publishers and publisher organizations, and to libraries and to consumers and to alt format providers as well. So, the whole spectrum.
And I suppose since 2014, technology has advanced quite a lot in terms of the ability to make things more accessible at scale as well. Yeah. What would you say have been the biggest kind of game changers? So, for example, I often talk about the pre-XML era and the post-XML era as being pretty transformative, right? But certainly when we think about the last 10 years, there'll certainly be other things that you will think about thinking, wow, that was a massive leap forward.
So my answer to this question is not going to be a technology thing, but a legislation thing. Mm-hmm. I actually think it's the EAA. Yeah, this is the thing that has been the most significant in the accessibility world, even in North America, maybe even especially in North America, where legislation is particularly toothless. It has absolutely no teeth in Canada, for example. There are things like the AODA, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, and the Accessible Canada Act. They're absolutely toothless when it comes to book publishing. But the European Accessibility Act has been dramatic in its impact on how everyone is forced to think about accessibility. If you want to sell books in the EU, you must think about accessibility and consider it at the very root of how you publish. So it's not, in my opinion, it's not really a technology thing, although all of those things have also concurrently come along. It's the EAA. So, for example, I genuinely think that the work that I'm involved with a small expert group who's advising the Adobe engineers who write InDesign on how to make a more accessible export from InDesign. And I think that work has the potential to be the most impactful, to be honest. And all of that work is absolutely driven by EAA and by June 2025 deadlines. So that change in that technology, because so many publishers use InDesign, and that's the starting point for so much content around the world, that has the potential to be the most impactful. And that is absolutely driven by the hovering, looming deadline of June 2025 and the European Accessibility Act. So that technology is being, brought along, kicking and screaming sometimes, by the EAA.
And you mentioned the kind of toothless nature of the legislation in Canada. Could you tell us a bit more about the kind of Canadian accessible publishing environment? Because of course we talk about the EAA and we talk about the US legislation quite often, but I don't know about you, Simon. I don't know very much about the Canadian accessible publishing landscape.
Yeah, so in a way, Canada is a little bit ahead of other jurisdictions in that in 2019, we had the federal government announced what I call a pot of gold. It was $22.8 million that was to be spent solely on accessible publishing and building capacity for accessible publishing in Canada. It was a gigantic sum of money. I think that an American listening to this will say 22.8 million is nothing, but I promise you in Canada, it was enormous. And a government ministry called the Department of Canadian Heritage dispersed this money through another pot of granting monies called the Canada Book Fund. The Canada Book Fund is designed to support Canadian independent publishers to publish competitively against, we live just north of gigantic cultural behemoth that is the United States. And the Canada Book Fund is meant to support publishers to be competitive in the market against, our much bigger American neighbors. The 22.8 million was spent on a lot of projects. It was spent over 5 years, so from 2019 to 2024, from March 2019 to March 2024. And it was spent giving money directly to publishers to figure out workflow issues, to hire consultants that help with that, to hire people to create accessible audiobooks, to remediate backlists, and that kind of thing. And then half the money was spent on projects. So it was given to things like the Association of Canadian Publishers and other groups like that. So publisher organizations. NELS and CELA, these are alt format libraries in Canada. NELS is the National Network for Equitable Library Services, and CELA is the Centre for Equitable Library Access. They're both what are known as authorized entities in Canada that serve the print disabled population. So their roles are to use the Marrakesh Treaty and the copyright exemption laid out in the Marrakesh Treaty to create content for readers with print disabilities. And generally, they do this on demand. Sometimes they do work with publishers to get content. But through that Accessible Books Initiative, that 22.8 million, they were involved in a number of projects. So NELS was heavily involved, for example, in consulting with publishers on, evaluating their digital workflows and telling them where the problems were and helping them figure those out and building capacity and working out the kinks in workflows. And one of the other things that came out of that Accessible Books Initiative, which I think is perhaps one of the most significant things, is an organization called eBound Canada, which is a wing of the Association of Canadian Publishers. eBound Canada is an organization I consult for regularly. They piloted a global certified accessible program licensing Benetech technologies to help Canadian publishers get certified. So at present, they have about 86 members, and I think about 80% of those are certified accessible in terms of their workflows, which is kind of amazing. And was, what I liked about that Benetech process is that it was an education in and of itself. So publishers who knew nothing about accessibility could submit their 3 ebooks and get detailed feedback, including code snippets and that sort of thing, to fix the problems in their workflows. And that has been really impactful in the Canadian marketplace.
And I think even for a publisher like Elsevier, who I work for, who I think was already doing a reasonable job around accessibility, we learned a lot from, we had a couple of go-rounds with Benetech and, we're certified now, but we learned a lot because one of the things about accessibility is that best practice moves forward a lot. So you mentioned eBound Canada, and one of the things I most know eBound for is their fantastic metadata report that came out, I think it was last year. And so it would be interesting to hear whether you had any involvement in that side of things and how you see the importance of metadata in ensuring a more accessible future for everybody accessing book content.
I'm so glad you asked. Remember when I told you I was a busybody?
Mm-hmm.
I wrote that report.
Well, it was fab and very helpful. So
thank you. That was a big project that came at the very end of the Accessible Books Initiative. So that was funded by that 22.8 million, and it came at the very end. And that was the kind of natural conclusion of all of that work on accessibility over 5 years in Canada, was this metadata report, because there's no point, as I think you both know, doing all that work on accessibility if you're not sort of doing the work to make that discoverable. And that work is writing good metadata. And I would say, I'm going to say something a little bit negative, but generally, I don't think publishers are all that good at writing metadata. I don't think that they're good at writing basic bibliographic metadata. My friends at Kobo are always complaining about how people don't use series metadata so that it's easy for people to find books that are linked within their own store. Metadata continues to be a challenge for publishers on a number of levels. And accessibility metadata is kind of next level in terms of challenging. Some of those data points and values in accessibility metadata are hard to understand. They're tricky. Their phrasings are not really straightforward for people who work in the space like me. Sometimes I have to go back and read what that means again to make sure that I'm applying it correctly, because it's not always clear. Accessibility metadata is written in the opposite of plain language, is what I like to say. So that report, I hope, went some way to making that a little bit plainer for publishers and making the journey for accessibility metadata. The first part of that report is about sort of where we are. It's a landscape review of the accessibility metadata landscape and how easy or not it is to write it and some of the essential problems in it. So one of the main themes that came out of the report is the utility of accessibility metadata is a real chicken or an egg problem. Publishers don't write good accessibility metadata because it's not exposed anywhere. Vendors don't expose accessibility metadata because no one's writing it.
Because no one's sending it.
So we need to solve that problem. And I think this is where the EAA can be especially helpful because it's required as part of the EAA. And so publishers must wrap their head around it. And then the second part of that report was around a large survey we did with people with print disabilities about what they would like to see out of accessibility metadata. And that was really interesting. One of the main themes that came out of that session was they were indifferent to accessibility metadata, but that was mostly because they hadn't seen a ton of it in the wild, right? And they had no idea that they could use this to filter how they shopped or how they looked through various vendors to look for content. I had an interview with someone who said, I don't know, I just download 10 books a day. If I can't read them, I return them. And I keep going. She was a rather voracious reader. So that happens. And I hate the idea of someone buying a book to see if it's accessible to them and then going through the hassle of returning it. Boy, that
100%.
It just makes me insane with, that's such an easy problem to solve. And accessibility metadata is right there. We should all be putting time and attention into it.
You wouldn't do it in any other walk of life, right?
Exactly.
And I think, why should it be different for disabled people?
Without question. I really hate that. And I hated hearing that story. And she was flip about it because this is just how she lives. I just download 10 more books from Kindle Unlimited. If I can't read them, I just return them. And I'm like,
Right, and so
dagger in my heart.
Just a follow-up question on that, as you probably know, and for the people listening to this podcast, they probably know as well. The W3C came out with some new metadata display guidelines in the past couple of weeks. Now, these, like all of these updates, have gone through various back and forths, and I think the International Publishers Association is still asking for publisher feedback, etc. And so I wondered if you had any thoughts on this new set of guidelines and whether you think they will help simplify and make more consistent the metadata landscape going forward.
Yeah, that's a great question. I hope so. That's what I hope. I hope that there's enough detailed information in there for vendors and publishers and consumers to figure out how to work out the kinks in this landscape. What I worry a lot about is that, and I worry about this all the time with standards work, is that it's written in standards language. And that's not always easy for normal mortals to consume. And I count myself among the normal mortals part of that, because it sometimes is really tricky to understand what folks are trying to say. And they're using really precise language because that's what they have to do. That's their remit. But that doesn't always translate into easy to understand. And so I just worry about that piece just a wee bit. And I think that there's still room for kind of a plain language explainer under the umbrella of that W3C work. And I hope someone's thinking about that. Someone who's not me.
And maybe a bit of prioritization as well.
Yeah.
As in, like, we know, whilst it would be great if every publisher did everything, we know that's probably not the case. So I always think these kind of must do, should do, could do kind of prioritization schemas are always quite important when you have quite long lists, like, for example, list 196 of Onyx's.
Yes, exactly. What I think this publishers need to figure out a kind of a common list of values that they're going to use in their books and then repurpose it. Because generally they're publishing kind of the same content over and over again. Like a STEM publisher is almost always going to have this set of values. A trade publisher who's mostly novels are going to have these values. And then interpret them intelligently, and maybe train your data people so that you're doing it in a smart way. There's also that new Daisy tool, which looks to be really useful around helping write accessibility metadata. I haven't had a chance to play with it yet, but that could be really helpful.
Yeah, I've been talking to publishers about that same idea of kind of metadata profiling, templating for some time. Anything we can do really to help publishers reduce the workload of doing it, because I think for most of them, it's sort of not knowing who should write this metadata. Is it a technical person? Is it a content person who's going to be able to understand the content in that way?
Yeah,
it's really interesting. You mentioned the trouble of trying to communicate this stuff to non-technical people. And of course, that's something that will come up for you a lot in your work. I'd love to know if you have any kind of thoughts on kind of effective communication about some of these quite complex technical concepts, but that do relate to published content. How do you talk about those to people from non-technical backgrounds?
Yeah, this is kind of the bane of my existence in a way. I really think that plain language is an undersung art form. And this is really critical. When you're talking to publishers, you can't talk about, you really have to kind of boil it down to first principles and use plain language as much as possible. Now, that doesn't mean to assume that people are non-technical or, unable to consume sort of high-level technical concepts. I don't assume people are dumb. But I do, in a way, I talk to people like I want to be talked to in terms of, sometimes I need to simmer with something for a little while in order for it to sort of sink in and understand it. In the early days of ebooks, what I often said was I needed to be taught something 5 or 6 times before it actually sunk in and became part of what I know, especially really technical things. So I do think that there are, I haven't solved that problem of how to talk about these highly technical things with people. So if you have, please share, Simon. I'd be very interested. I think we do very similar work, so maybe we should collaborate on that.
Yeah.
So I think it's tricky and it's an ongoing challenge. Just like acronyms are designed sometimes, I swear acronyms are designed to put up barriers between people, because I have to look up what ARIA stands for every single time I explain it to people. I never remember. It's like a brain burp I have. I hate acronyms, and I feel the same way about highly technical phrasing and language. It's designed to alienate, and I don't want to do that.
Yeah, I guess it's a shorthand for people who have to use these terms constantly, but by using it, a drawbridge is raised.
Totally.
To people wanting to understand it. So do you find it's particularly acute with people from kind of editorial background when you're trying to explain that actually this stuff does have editorial implications, right? This is not a technical island.
Yeah, I absolutely do. I think that there's various tranches in publishing, and they're all very set in their ways. And, I'm convinced that the key to moving the needle when it comes to accessible publishing is getting editorially heavily invested in the process. And editorial is, in a way, stuck in their ways. The pandemic was kind of awesome because it forced a lot of editorial staff, a lot of staff that I worked with, to stop working with pen on paper or pencil on paper and move to digitizing their processes. I was working for a small indie publisher at the time, and very early in the pandemic, we had some workshops on how to use PDF tools because they weren't familiar with them, and we had to drag them kicking and screaming into that process because that was how we had to work now. Just was the way it was. Everyone was remote. And so explaining some, like when I say things like structure and hierarchy to editorial staff, their eyes glaze over a little bit, even though they know what I mean by that. They already know because they're already thinking about manuscripts in a really holistic way, right? That is a level that we have to kind of, I'm not saying it's not talking down. It's just making it more understandable. I sound like I assume everyone is dumb, and it's really not the case. I just want to put it in terms that they understand in their working life.
Right. And it's to do with familiarity, right? It's not about people being dumb. It's to do with what's part of your everyday.
Yeah.
And I think I would also say it's about the principles of accessibility, right? Yeah. Accessible language and accessible terminology as well as accessible technology.
Quite right.
And on that, you talked about editorial. One question it brings to my mind, I spent quite a lot of my career on the editorial side, commissioning books and managing journals and that kind of thing. How do you see the role of authors in making books accessible? And do you think that role is different in trade publishing versus in, you mentioned STM publishing?
Yeah, that's a great question, Simon. I think a couple of years ago, I was invited by the Writers Union of Canada to write an article about accessibility for their magazine that goes out to all manner of writers in Canada. And I was pretty delighted with that opportunity. And I really spent most of that article talking about how to use Word a little bit better. Because I think that there's absolutely a role for all kinds of authors to play in the accessibility ecosystem. I have never seen a manuscript submitted that didn't need to have all its formatting undone and redone. Authors think they need to typeset their Word documents, and all that work has to be undone and then redone properly because they're not using those tools in a way that's meaningful for workflows, that can go through the whole system and keep its integrity. I often think about things like language shifts. So I converted a novel a couple of years ago that had little snippets of Chinese in it. And I, at the very end of the workflow, I was converting that novel into an ebook, and I had to guess what language that was because I have no knowledge of Chinese languages, and no one was available to tell me, is this Chinese? Is this Mandarin? Is it Cantonese? Is it simplified Chinese? Is it, what is it? So I had to guess and cross my fingers and hope for the best. That is something that an author, even the author of a novel, could be doing inside of the Word file by marking that language shift accurately, and then flagging that for the editorial staff to make sure it doesn't go missing when the manuscript goes through the editorial processes. So there's absolutely a role to play for authors. And then when it comes to STEM publishing, it's a little bit more complex because STEM authors absolutely must be involved in alt text writing. Right? They're the best people to write image descriptions for the content in their books. That doesn't mean that editors don't have a role to play when it comes to those image descriptions, because I'm sure authors think every image needs to be described with another novel and that needs to be edited down. But I think that just like it's key to move the needle on accessibility to get editorial staff involved, it's also critical to sort of raise awareness of these issues with the people who are writing the content that we consume as well.
So I just wanted to quickly add for anybody who's wondering about the language shift thing, because I think this is a massive problem for a lot of publishers that we don't really have a great answer to. And I think you've suggested what might be an answer there. For those who don't know, if you don't tag a language shift in the underlying code, then a screen reader, for instance, won't change into the correct voice, and you get to hear some pretty amazing things, like the English voice reading French. It's hilarious, but not necessarily very useful. So you talked about authors being able to offer that. Have you any other ideas about how that can be handled in process?
Yeah, I think that in addition to authors being involved, I think it's critical for editorial staff to be involved as well in both the language shifts and in marking up things like the difference between emphasis and italics so that those are voiced accurately. When something is meant to be read with vocal stress, it should be tagged with an M tag so that it's read accurately by a screen reader. And then something that's just italics for style reasons doesn't need to be read with emphasis. It shouldn't be up to production staff in a publishing house to figure out which those are and what should be bold and what should be strong and that sort of thing. That should be a decision that's made by someone editorially involved, either the author or a copy editor, the substantive editor, whomever. But that should be done at that level. In my experience, it's never done. I have it exactly one set of InDesign files in my life where that was separated out. And I almost fell off my chair because I've never seen it before. I was so happy. But yeah, it's very rare to see in the wild.
And do you find then, just staying on the languages question for a sec, do you find that there are some languages or some parts of the world where accessible formats and best practice and stuff are followed better and others not so much, or can you not really separate it out like that?
I don't know that I've seen anything quite like that where it's separated out, like Americans are actually better at tagging languages than Canadians or something like that. I don't know. But it did make me think, in Canada, we have a lot of content that has snippets of Indigenous languages in it. And sometimes there's no language code for the specific language that we're looking at. That happens. It happens more often than you would think. And I was working on a book yesterday in Word. I needed to tag a whole bunch of phrases as Cree, and there was no Cree language code built into Word to do that. And I wasted way too much time trying to figure out how to add in a language pack that supported that, and then decided I would just create a character style for those snippets and cross my fingers and hope for the best. But, the fact of the matter is that some of these language shifts aren't going to get voiced accurately almost no matter what.
Right.
Particularly when it comes to Indigenous languages. And, there's something like 300 Indigenous languages in Canada. And they're just not all that well supported.
I could imagine it going wrong even for English, where there are so many borrow words, particularly if somebody tried some sort of automated method, then you might pick some of those up with a funny accent.
Yeah. That said, I had a long conversation this week with a colleague about using AI to detect language shifts, which I'm very interested in knowing whether or not that would be useful. I know that Word has some built-in language detections in there. You can, set it to automatically detect languages. I'm curious about how it would do with languages that are super similar, like Portuguese or Spanish. Can it tell the difference between those two languages? AI? I don't know.
I suppose
I'm hopeful.
On the AI.
Yeah,
right? Depends on the AI and depends on how it's used. And kind of more generally, just kind of shifting gear a bit since you mentioned AI. AI is probably the most controversial topic out there at the moment for all kinds of reasons, and certainly for accessibility, AI has great potential to at scale make books more accessible, but obviously it has quite a lot of dangers as well, especially when we're talking about things like content creation, thinking about alt text creation and what have you. And I guess I'd be interested to hear your opinions about the use of AI, whether it's, automated bots scraping books and assigning metadata tags, or it's around AI or narrative audio for video, or, plain language summaries or anything else.
Image description.
Yeah. Any thoughts about kind of the possibilities, but also any concerns that you might have?
Yeah. My own personal non-disabled approach to AI is to have a knee-jerk, put up brick walls reaction to AI. And what I find is my print-disabled colleagues, they're all bullish on AI and they're interested in exploring what's possible. And I had to take my cue from them. I think a lot of the kind of knee-jerk, oh no AI for me, please, is maybe a little bit ableist. Anything that helps people navigate the world better is a useful tool if it's used intelligently.
And I think that's the big thing. And as a visually impaired person myself, my thing is always something is better than nothing, or hopefully better than nothing, right? I use a screen reader, and at the moment, if a book doesn't have alt text, it'll get to an image and just completely skip the image. So if by using AI at scale, we can have some information about the image, some information is better than no information, as long as obviously the information isn't completely incorrect.
Yeah. I teach a couple of classes on accessibility in book publishing at Toronto Metropolitan University and Simon Fraser Universities in Canada. And one of the assignments I give to students early in the semester is to read a book using a screen reader. And to a person, they all complain about synthetic voice. And they all get feedback about how that's an ableist take, and they need to interrogate why they think that. The synthetic voice isn't the devil. Sometimes it's the only way you have to consume content. So understanding that people would prefer human voice, synthetic voice is fine, and it's fine for loads of people. It helps people get stuff done.
Also, try synthetic voice from 20 years ago compared to synthetic voice today, right? Synthetic voice today is lovely compared to what it was like, certainly when I was a child.
Well, you can still hear the synthetic voice of the past. If you get a scam call, they're still using those terrible old... Yeah, I think people don't realize how far it's come, particularly the AI-powered ones. Mm-hmm. The other thing is, I think people don't understand that the speed settings, right? How important that is. How a lot of people will put the speed as high as one might read with your eyes, right? Mm-hmm. People want to get through it, which is much more tailored than just using kind of a built-in text-to-speech that only might have one speed when it's coming from a screen reader and people can set their own preference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it totally. I have a friend who listens to things at 6 times, and every once in a while I can hear it, and wow. It just gives me anxiety, and I have to cover my ears and move away. Wow. But he's just he can just motor through stuff. Honestly, it's impressive.
But then we all know people who read that quickly visually. There are lots of people who have that crazy fast reading, and it's just a reroute of the same skill.
It depends on the type of content as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Would you want to read poetry at 6 times the speed, for example?
Good point.
Yeah. You might not, but if it's an instruction manual or something, then actually that might be appropriate.
No, that's not a good example. I think you should definitely read the instructions at a normal pace.
Yeah.
So Simon mentioned AI as the most controversial thing we could talk about, but I'm going to one-up him and ask you to talk about the strange goings-on of your southern neighbours. We had an episode last week talking all about this, but I would love to know the kind of Canadian perspective on the strange things going on with the Trump administration and the impact that's having on accessible publishing.
Yeah. This is the question of the day. The Trump administration has this very strange ability to unite Canadians, something that has never been done before, ever. The French and the English are agreeing on something in Canada. That's never happened. I am so worried about things that bubble up from south of us in so many ways. But what I think could be a silver lining for Canada is I've heard rumblings that Canada should join the EU, and man, am I in favor of that, because then we would have some decent accessibility legislation in this country, and that would make me really happy. But the broader impact of things that are happening in the United States, on what's happening in Canada is it actually makes people shore up what they're doing and recommit to DEIA principles in their organizations, in how they publish, in how they operate in the world. That seems to be the after effect on Canada once we get past thinking about tariffs and trade wars and all kinds of other unthinkable things. So one, I would love to join the EU and have the EAA be applicable to all Canadian publishers. Oh, that would be awesome. It's a bit of a pipe dream, but I would love it. I don't even know how it's feasible. We're not even close to the EU.
They could transpose the act into Canadian law, or at least a version of it.
My understanding is that there is no impulse to do that. In general, Canadian legislators prefer carrots over sticks. That's the line that they use. And neither the carrots or the sticks are working, in my not so humble opinion. And I would love for, better enforcement of accessible first principles. The Accessible Canada Act governs communications, intergovernmental communications. And my print-disabled friends who work in the government tell me all the time that they get things from their colleagues that are absolutely not accessible. And when they send it back and ask for an accessible version of it, they'll get it in 6 months. So these kinds of legislations are just fundamentally not working, not even where they're supposed to, like on government comms. So, it's a shambles in a way, how this gets applied and how it works. People are still worried about PDF in an era when HTML is right there. I don't know. I just shake my head about those things. So would love to join the EU, but also I think that the impact of what's happening in the States is that more people are thinking about DEIA and recommitting to it in foundational ways. And I think that's always a good thing. I'm interested in inclusivity at fundamental and high levels. And so I think that can't be a bad thing.
Laura, thank you for talking with us through such a kind of whistle-stop tour through so much affecting accessible publishing, and for telling us a bit more about your career. Is there any kind of message you want to leave the listeners with at this rather peculiar and acute moment for our industry?
Christina Musinelli from Fondazione Lia has this statement about how accessibility is a culture, and I love to repeat that whenever I can. It's such a quick, a useful soundbite. Accessibility is a culture, and there's a lot of publishers who haven't really started yet. And what I say to them is just start, baby steps. Let's go. Just take one step after the other. Boil it down into bite-sized bits and get your staff involved, and just get started. Accessibility is a culture that has to be worked at and has to be maintained and has to be thought about every single day. Accessibility is everyone's job, and in order for that to in order for us to have truly inclusive outcomes, everybody has to be involved, and we have to build a culture around how we publish.
What a fantastic message to leave everybody with. Thank you, Laura. And Laura, if any of the listeners want to get hold of you, how should they do that?
I have a website. It's laurabrady.ca, laurabrady.ca. And I have a blog there where I write about issues affecting accessible publishing. I'm also on LinkedIn. You can find me by searching for Laura Brady Accessibility Busybody. Pretty sure.
Perfect.
I'm happy to connect there as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Laura. And thank you very much to Simon as well for hosting this episode with me.
Thanks very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. We'll be back in your ears soon for another episode of the Digital Publishing Podcast.